Let me tell you about a cold morning in the high desert of southern New Mexico, in a ranching town called Cabazon Wells, in the spring of 1983. It was the kind of March morning where the sun comes up hard over the Sacramento foothills, but the cold still sits in the gravel under your boots. There was an estate auction that morning, the way there always was after a hard winter, on a flat dirt lot behind the old feed cooperative. And on that lot, between a rusted hay rake and a stack of warped fence posts, sat a thing nobody wanted. A heavy old machinist's toolbox, the rolling kind, steel scorched black down one side. The lid buckled and seized so hard the top tray would not lift and the drawers would not pull. And I want you to understand, before this story goes anywhere, that 30-some people stood around that lot in their coats with their hands in their pockets, and not one of them raised a finger for that toolbox until a man named Howard Lindqvist did. The auctioneer called it at $40, and a man named Garrett Pruitt laughed out loud before the word sold had even finished leaving the auctioneer's mouth. He laughed the way a big man laughs when he wants the whole lot to hear him do it. Head tipped back, one thick hand slapping the side of the flatbed trailer. Garrett Pruitt ran the largest equipment hauling and salvage business in the county. 3 counties, really, and he liked the whole valley to know it. He called across the heads of the crowd in a voice that was built to travel. $40 for a boat anchor, Lindqvist. You finally found something heavier than your own head. A few men chuckled, the way men do when the loud one makes the joke and they don't want to be on the wrong side of it. Howard Lindqvist did not look at him. He looked at the toolbox. Now here's what you need to understand about Howard. He was 58 years old that spring, a lean man with square shoulders and a slow way of moving. Like a man who had learned long ago that hurrying mostly just breaks things. He had spent close to 40 years in a single-bay repair shop off the old highway, 2 miles out of town, fixing the machines that kept a ranching county alive. Well pumps, irrigation motors, the diesel hearts of old tractors, the gearboxes nobody else would touch. His hands were the hands of a man who fixed things. The knuckles were thickened, one thumbnail permanently dark, and there was a long pale scar across the back of the left hand from a wrench that had slipped 30 years back. He wore a tan canvas work cap gone soft at the brim, a faded blue work shirt, and a dark denim jacket with a torn breast pocket that he had stitched shut himself with the wrong color thread, because Howard fixed what could be fixed, and did not much care how it looked when he was done. People in Cabazon Wells had a name for him by then. They called him the Reviver, half as a joke and half not, because he bought dead machines that nobody else would carry off for free, and he brought them back. And because, in all the years anybody could remember, he had never once raised his voice. Not when the bank squeezed him in the lean years. Not even the autumn his wife Ada passed, when half the town came by the shop and found him quietly tuning a pump motor with the radio off and his eyes dry and far away. The toolbox had come out of the old Renner place, and everyone at that auction knew the Renner place. Old Silas Renner had run the only machine shop in the valley for 40-some years. The real kind. The kind that could turn apart on a lathe and weld a cracked manifold and rebuild a magneto from memory, back before the parts trucks came in from Las Cruces twice a week and made all of that look slow. The fire that took his shop the winter before had been the talk of the whole basin. They saved the cinder block walls and almost nothing else. The shop's whole contents went to the estate sale on that flatbed. A melted bench grinder, a cracked vise, a drum of seized bearings, and the big steel rolling toolbox that had stood beside Silas Renner's lathe for as long as anyone living could remember. The heat had welded it shut. When the auctioneer's helper had tried to roll the top tray open as a joke, it had not given a quarter inch, and the crowd had laughed, and the boy had set the lid back down and called it scrap. Howard had stood at the back and watched the boy fail to open it, and something in the way the drawer would not move had made him step forward. It was not the steel, though the steel and the casters and the good drawer slides were worth more than $40 to a man who knew metal. It was the weight. He had hauled enough empty toolboxes across enough shop floors in his life to know what an empty one felt like when you tipped it on its casters. And when the auctioneer's boy had rocked that one back to set it down, it had not shifted the way an empty box shifts. Something inside it was holding still. Howard had felt that stillness from 20 feet away, the way you feel a held breath in a quiet room, and he had raised his hand before he had quite finished deciding to. He loaded it into the bed of his old pickup alone, refusing the two younger men who drifted over to help, because a man learns the balance of a thing by carrying it himself. Garrett Pruitt said something to the two fellows beside him, and the two fellows grinned, and Howard drove the 9 miles home with the toolbox riding behind him, in the bed like a passenger he had agreed to take somewhere. He did not force it open that night. And that, right there, is the thing the men who laughed never understood about Howard Lindqvist. He did not force anything. He rolled it into the bay, set it under the hanging light, and wiped the soot off the buckled lid with a rag and a little kerosene. And under the char he found the maker's stamp pressed into the steel. And below it, scratched by hand with a scribe a long time ago, 2 words: Renner, Cabazon. Then he turned off the light and went into the house and went to bed. And the toolbox waited where he had left it. People think a quiet man is an empty man. They are usually wrong. And if you have ever watched somebody who is good at a quiet thing get laughed at by louder people who could not do that thing themselves, then you already understand the kind of story this is. And I think you'll want to stay for the rest of it. Because here's the part that matters. The loudest man at the auction is almost never the one who knows what he is looking at. Howard knew. He had known from 20 feet. A rolling machinist's toolbox of that era was often the single most valuable thing a tradesman owned. Not for the box itself, but for what a lifetime of work put inside it. Master machinists frequently hand-ground their own specialty tooling, gauges, and fixtures that could not be bought at any price, only made. When such a man died, his toolbox held decades of irreplaceable custom craft. Buyers who saw only scrap steel were, in the truest sense, looking at a closed book and judging it by the cover. Part 2. Let me tell you how Howard worked, because the way a man works tells you everything about how he lives. He worked on the toolbox the way he worked on everything, in the quiet hours around the paying jobs, after the well pump rebuilds and the tractor clutches and the irrigation motors that kept the alfalfa green were buttoned up, and the day's customers had gone home. He learned its bones first. The rust had fused the top tray to the frame and seized the drawer slides solid, and the fire had warped the steel just enough that nothing inside could be reached the easy way. He could have taken a cutting torch to it in an afternoon and had it gutted by supper. He did not. The torch would have ruined whatever the toolbox was keeping. And by then Howard was certain it was keeping something, because every time he rocked it on its casters, that small dead weight inside shifted and stopped, like a stone settling in a sealed jar. Now here's what you need to understand about the man who had laughed. In those same years, Garrett Pruitt could not stop talking. Pruitt Salvage and Hauling had 4 new trucks and a yard out by the highway full of chrome and diesel, and a sign you could read from a quarter-mile off. And Garrett liked to remind the valley of all of it. He had bid against Howard for years on the dead lots, and lost interest the second a thing looked too far gone to flip quick for a profit at the cafe. He told the $40 story to anybody who would hold still for it. And the story grew in the telling the way Garrett's stories always did, until inside a year it had become the time Howard Lindqvist paid $100 for a burnt-up junk box that wouldn't even open. Howard heard the versions come back to him secondhand, from customers, from the boy at the parts counter, and he never corrected a single one. He had a toolbox to understand, and a living to make, and Garrett Pruitt's mouth was Garrett Pruitt's own business. The shop did not get rich. It got by. Howard kept the lights on through the lean winters the way he always had, by taking the jobs the dealerships in Las Cruces turned away, by charging a fair number, by fixing the thing right the first time so it stayed fixed. There was a February that year when a water truck went through the ice on the stock tank up on the Aldous spread, north of town, nose down in 8 feet of freezing slurry. Pruitt's outfit drove up, looked at it, and drove away, because the recovery would tie up a wrecker for 2 days and might bend a frame. And there was no quick money in it. Howard came out at first light with a borrowed flatbed, a hand winch, and a set of timbers, and he rigged it the slow way, an inch at a time, reading the angle of the load the way another man reads a page. And he had that water truck up on dry caliche by dark of the second day without a single panel creased. The Aldous boy tried to pay him double. Howard took the fare number and not $1 more, and he drove home past the Pruitt yard with its 4 trucks idling under the floodlights, and he did not slow down to look. The toolbox sat in the corner of the bay through all of it, the soot wiped off now, the steel coming back to a low, honest gray where his rag had worked it. The drawers still shut. Some evenings after the last job was done and the young fellow who swept up had gone home, Howard would roll it out under the hanging light and just look at it. He never pried. He would press a thumb against the seized tray to feel it refuse him, and he would rock it a half inch to feel that small weight inside settle and stop. And then he would roll it back into the corner. A man who has buried a wife learns that some things open when they are ready and not one day before, and that the man who pries is a fool. Howard had time. He had always had more time than the loud men, because he never wasted any of it being loud. And the turn came the way those turns always come, slowly, and then all at once. The state finally paved the new bypass out east of town, and the through traffic that had kept Pruitt Salvage fat moved out there with it, away from the old road. And Garrett's 4 new trucks turned out to be 4 new payments. He had borrowed against the chrome, the way men do who believe the loud years will never end. When the work thinned, the payments did not. And a man who has spent 30 years being the loudest voice at the auction does not know how to go quiet when the bank starts calling on a Tuesday afternoon. Pruitt Salvage and Hauling went under in the late summer of 1985. The trucks were repossessed off the very yard Garrett had paraded them across. And Howard Lindqvist's single bay shop was still open, 9 miles away, still taking the dead jobs, still getting by. Nobody laughed about the $40 after that. There was nobody left who wanted to. And here's the part that tells you who Howard really was. He did not gloat. He sent his apprentice, a serious, careful young man named Marcus Cordell, who had come on 2 years back and stayed, over to the Pruitt yard to see if any of the old recovery rigging was worth saving before the bank hauled it all off for pennies. And when Marcus came back with a good hand winch and a set of chains and an honest accounting of what he'd paid, Howard paid him for the day and said not one word about Garrett. That was the whole of his vindication, and he wanted no more of it than that. The Valley had been wrong about him for years, and being proven right out in public gave Howard no pleasure at all, because the proving had cost a man his trucks, and Howard had carried too many dead machines in his life to take any joy in watching another one die. In rural economies of the American West, the boom and bust cycle was rarely about luck. It was about leverage. A business that financed rapid expansion against the assumption of permanent prosperity carried enormous fixed costs that could not flex downward when conditions changed. A new highway, a drought, a closed mill. The patient operator who owned his tools outright and lived below his means could survive a downturn that wiped out a far larger competitor. Slow capital, paid for in cash, was often the only kind that lasted. Part 3. It was 2 years, almost to the day after the auctioneer called that toolbox at $40, that the thing finally opened. Marcus Cordell was nearly a full partner by then, steadier with his hands than Howard had been at that age. And it was Marcus who found the trick of it. He worked the seized top tray with penetrating oil and a week of patience and the smallest brass drift he could file down on the bench grinder, tapping, waiting, tapping, the way Howard had taught him without ever quite saying he was teaching. The tray gave a 1/4 inch on a Tuesday evening in the autumn of 1985, and then another 1/4. The old fused steel letting go of itself with a long groaning sound, like a held breath finally let out. Howard did not rush in, and I want you to sit with that, because it is the whole measure of the man. He set down the magneto he was rebuilding, and he wiped his hands slow on the rag, and he came and stood at the bench beside the young man, and together they eased the top tray back the rest of the way. The tray itself held what you'd expect: good wrenches, gone orange with rust but whole, a set of taps, a machinist's square. Howard lifted them out one at a time and set them in a row on the bench, the way you'd lay out something that had belonged to a man you respected. And then he worked the long bottom drawer, the deep one, the one where the weight had been riding all this time. It came open hard, screaming on its dry slides, and then it came free. And there, wedged at the very back, jammed up under the lip of the frame where it had slid during the fire, and lodged solid when the metal cooled, was the small dead weight Howard had felt from 20 feet away on a cold March morning 2 years gone. It was a flat steel cash box, the kind with a little handle on top, soldered shut at the seams by the heat of the fire, scorched but whole. And it was the thing that had held the drawer from moving all that time. And it was the thing Howard had known was there before he had ever raised his hand at the auction. He took it to the bench under the hanging light, and he worked the lid loose, slow, with a thin blade in his patient hands, careful not to spring the metal. And when it opened, here is what was inside, wrapped in an oilcloth gone stiff with age. The first thing was a folded sheaf of papers, stock certificates, the heavy old engraved kind, in the name of a copper concern out of Arizona, bought a few shares at a time across the 1950s and 60s. Silas Renner, it turned out, had been quietly buying into the mines whose broken machinery he spent his life repairing, tucking the certificates into the one place in his shop no thief and no fire was ever meant to reach. And the shares had gone on quietly, splitting and paying out the whole time the steel box sat seized in the dark on Howard's shop floor. A man at the bank in Cabazon Wells, and then a broker in Las Cruces, added them up twice to be sure. With 3 decades of growth and reinvested dividends, the certificates were worth a little over $31,000. The second thing was a small ledger, no bigger than a man's hand, and it was not a shop ledger. It was a list of names. Down the left side, in Silas Renner's cramped, careful hand, were the families of Cabazon Wells, and beside each name was a figure, and the figures were jobs, pump rebuilds and welded plows and tractor repairs and engine work, all done across the hard years, the drought years, the years the cattle prices fell through the floor, and half the valley could not pay a repair bill if their lives hung on it. And the last column was the one that stopped Howard cold. Beside almost every figure, year after year, Silas had written a single word in pencil: forgiven, forgiven, forgiven. The old machinist had kept the whole valley's iron running on credit through the lean times, and then quietly, on his own books, he had let those debts go and told nobody, and let the county think the shop simply scraped by on thin margins like everyone else's. The third thing in the box was a letter, and it was not addressed to Howard, because Silas Renner had died in the fire that took his shop, and could not have known whose patient hands would one day work that drawer free. It was addressed, in the same careful hand, to whoever finally gets this drawer to move. Howard read it once to himself under the hanging light, and then, because Marcus was standing there and had earned it, he read it again out loud. If you are reading this, then the lock that beat everyone else did not beat you. Which means you are the patient kind, and the patient kind is the only kind I would trust with what is in this box. The shares are for whoever keeps the shop after me, to keep the doors open through whatever bad year comes next, because there is always a next one. The book is so somebody will know the valley was carried, and carried quiet, the way a thing like that ought to be carried. I never wanted the credit for it, and I do not want it now. Be good to the ones who come in short. That is the whole of it. S.R. Howard sat with the letter a long time. The shop was dead quiet around the two of them, the hanging light steady, the old steel toolbox open at last on the bench between two men who fix things for a living. Then he folded the letter back along its old creases and set it back in the steel box where it had ridden for nearly 40 years. Savings instruments left in hidden caches were more common in the rural West than people realize. Men who had lived through the bank failures of the 1930s often did not trust banks with everything, and so they kept a portion of their wealth in physical certificates, gold, or bonds, hidden in places only they knew. The tragedy was that this distrust frequently meant the wealth was lost entirely when the owner died suddenly, buried in walls, sealed in tools, forgotten in attics. For every cash that was found, no one can say how many were simply hauled off as scrap. Part 4. Now here is the part of the story that tells you what a man does when life finally hands him the thing the loud people always thought he was a fool for chasing. Howard Lindqvist did not keep the money for himself. I want to be plain about that, because it is the hinge the whole story turns on. He took the certificates down to the bank, and over a few weeks he sold them out, every share, and the bank wired the money into an account with his name on it. A little over $31,000, more cash than Howard had seen in one place in his entire working life. And with it, he did a thing that surprised young Marcus Cordell, and surprised the whole valley a little when word of it got around. He bought back the old Renner place. The cinderblock walls still stood on the corner where the machine shop had been, blackened but sound, and the lot had sat empty and weed grown since the fire. Howard bought it, and he had the roof rebuilt, and the bay doors rehung, and he opened it again, not as the grand old machine shop it had been, because that day was gone, and Howard was honest enough to know it, but as a working repair shop with a counter at the front. And on that counter, where it had stood beside Silas Renner's lathe for 40 years, Howard set the same steel rolling toolbox, cleaned and freed and oiled and finally able to open, the drawers running smooth on their slides now under his patient hands. And he ran a tab for anyone in Cabazon Wells who came in short, the rancher who needed his pump fixed before he could sell a single calf, the widow whose furnace motor died in January, the young family whose only truck had thrown a rod. Howard did the work, and he wrote the figure in a ledger. And when they could not pay, he wrote a single word beside it in pencil: forgiven. The way he had been taught to, by a dead man's hand, out of a box that had kept its secret for 40 years until the right person came to open it. Silas Renner's old ledger, the one with the forgiven names Howard framed and hung on the wall behind the counter, open to the page of names so that the valley could finally see what it had been carried by without ever once knowing. And people came in just to read it. Some of them found their own parents' names on that list, their own grandparents, the figure beside the name and the pencil word below it. And they stood there in the middle of a working repair shop and understood, 40 years too late, what the quiet old man with the lathe had done for them and never said. Howard never made much of it when they did. He would nod from the back of the bay and wipe his hands on the rag and let the wall do the talking. And the reopened corner drew the same kind of quiet, decent people Howard had always been. A retired carpenter named Eli Fontaine came by the first week with a level and a box of screws and squared the old front counter without being asked. And the only thing he asked in return was, "You eaten yet?" A widow named Reba Salinas, who had run the little cafe across the road before the fire, started leaving a thermos of coffee on the steel toolbox every cold morning, and she was gone before Howard could ever thank her. They were not paid, and they were not thanked, and they came back anyway, the way that kind of person always does. And inside of a year, the corner where the Renner shop had stood was again what it had been under old Silas, a place a whole town leaned on without ever quite noticing that it leaned. Garrett Pruitt came in once near the end. He was an old man by then, and a thin one, the loudness long gone out of him, the salvage yard a memory, his big voice spent. He stood at the counter a good while and looked at the framed ledger on the wall, and then he looked at the steel toolbox he had once called a boat anchor for the whole lot to hear. He did not say he was sorry, because men like Garrett rarely find the words for it, and Howard did not ask him to. Howard fixed the little bench grinder Garrett had carried in under his arm, the last working thing the old man owned, and he set it on the counter. And when Garrett reached for his thin wallet, Howard looked at the ledger, and then he wrote the figure down, and beside it, in pencil, he wrote the one word, and Garrett Pruitt read it upside down across the counter, and his eyes went wet, and he could not speak, and he went out into the bright cold without a word. The man who had laughed loudest had lived to see what the quiet man had heard from 20 feet away, and the seeing was enough. Howard wanted nothing more from him than that. Marcus Cordell runs the shop now. Howard is buried out past the bypass beside Ada, under a plain stone he picked out himself. And the steel toolbox still sits on the counter at the corner where the Renner place was, freed and clean and open, its drawers running smooth. The framed ledger still hangs behind it, open to the forgiven names. Marcus keeps the tab the way Howard kept it, and the way Silas Renner kept it before either of them was born, in pencil, with the one word ready for the ones who come in short. 3 men have written that word in that book now, each one taught by the one before, and none of them ever saying much about it. The little steel cash box sits up on the shelf above the bench where the toolbox used to wait. It is empty now. Its work is done. Its long, stubborn job of holding that drawer shut and keeping its secret safe through a fire and a sale and 2 years of dark, finally finished. I keep turning this over, and I would like to know where you land. Howard was 58 the cold morning he raised his hand for $40, and 60 the autumn evening that drawer finally moved, and the old men in Cabazon Wells still tell it right, the way it actually went, and not the way Garrett Pruitt used to tell it at the cafe. A thing that will not open is not always broken. Sometimes it is only keeping something safe until the patient hands finally arrive. So if you had stood in that gravel lot on that cold morning, would you have heard the held weight inside that scorched steel the way Howard did, and raised your hand? Or would you have laughed along with Garrett and called it a boat anchor and walked on by? The practice of carrying neighbors on credit and quietly forgiving the debt was a real and largely undocumented feature of small American communities, especially in the rural West. Tradesmen, storekeepers, and doctors often absorbed losses they never spoke of, understanding that the survival of the whole community was worth more than the balance of any single ledger. This invisible economy of mercy rarely appears in official histories, because by its very nature it was never written down for others to see. It survived only in pencil and in memory, and in the rare moment when a hidden book was finally found.